I want to speak today not as someone trying to provoke controversy, but as a former Christian theologian who spent decades reading the Bible closely in its original languages with love and reverence. And what I discovered about Ishmael is something many Americans have simply never been shown, not because it is hidden, but because it is rarely emphasized. And when we go back to Genesis itself, we find a narrative far more nuanced, compassionate, and inclusive than modern assumptions allow, because Ishmael is not portrayed in the Bible as a cursed outsider or rejected child in the way popular culture often suggests, but rather as a son of Abraham who is directly blessed by God himself. And this matters deeply because Abraham is the patriarch not only of Israel, but of faith itself. And when God speaks promises over Ishmael in Genesis, those promises are not minor, symbolic, or temporary, but explicit, repeated, and affirmed by divine authority. For Scripture tells us that God hears the cry of Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness, and God names the child Ishmael, meaning God hears, which already tells us something profound about divine concern, because God does not ignore Ishmael. God responds to him, and when Abraham pleads on behalf of his firstborn son, saying, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you," God does not rebuke Abraham for asking, nor does he dismiss Ishmael as irrelevant. But instead, God declares that Ishmael will be blessed, multiplied greatly, and become the father of 12 princes, a phrase that mirrors the language later used for the tribes of Israel. And this parallel is not accidental because the Bible itself acknowledges Ishmael as a legitimate line of blessing, even while affirming Isaac's covenantal role. And these two truths are not mutually exclusive, yet many readers are taught to see them as such. And when Ishmael is sent into the wilderness with his mother, the text does not depict this as divine rejection, but as human fear and social tension. And it is God who intervenes to save Ishmael's life, opening Hagar's eyes to a well of water, sustaining the child, guiding him, and remaining with him as he grows into a nation. And this is crucial because the biblical God is not portrayed as abandoning Ishmael, but as accompanying him, protecting him, and establishing him. And when we later read that Ishmael becomes an archer, settles in Arabia, and fathers a great people, the Bible does not frame this as a tragic footnote, but as fulfillment. And what many Americans have never been encouraged to reflect upon is that Ishmael is present at Abraham's burial alongside Isaac, standing together as sons, which symbolizes reconciliation, dignity, and shared heritage, not eternal hostility. And when we examine the Bible without inherited bias, we see that hostility arises later from human history, not divine decree, because the text never says God cursed Ishmael or condemned his descendants. And in fact, the moral failures recorded in Genesis are attributed to individuals, not entire lineages. And this becomes even clearer when we remember that many biblical figures married into Ishmaelite or Arabian lines, and that trade, kinship, and interconnection existed long before later political narratives hardened divisions. And as someone who once preached from Christian pulpits, I can say honestly that many churchgoers have simply never been taught to read these passages with care, context, or humility, because the Bible does not erase Ishmael from God's plan, it situates him within it. And when we fast forward to later biblical prophets, we see repeated affirmations that God's mercy extends beyond one tribe, one nation, or one genealogy, because the God of Abraham is not tribal in his compassion. And this is why the story of Ishmael matters so deeply today, because it challenges the idea that faith must be inherited through exclusion rather than recognition. And when Muslims later honor Ishmael as a prophet and ancestor, they are not inventing a foreign narrative, but building upon a biblical foundation that already exists, one that acknowledges Ishmael's legitimacy, his divine blessing, and his place within Abraham's family. And this does not diminish Isaac, nor does it negate Israel, but it expands our understanding of how God works through multiple branches of the same tree. And the tragedy is not that Ishmael exists in the Bible, but that many readers have been taught to overlook him, misunderstand him, or reduce him to a symbol of rejection, when the text itself says otherwise. And if Americans were simply encouraged to read Genesis without assumptions, they would discover that the Bible they revere speaks of a God who hears Ishmael, saves Ishmael, blesses Ishmael, and fulfills promises to Ishmael. And this realization does not weaken faith, it strengthens it, because it reveals a God whose mercy is wider than our traditions, whose promises are deeper than our divisions, and whose concern for humanity cannot be confined to one lineage alone. And when we allow Scripture to speak for itself, Ishmael emerges not as an enemy, but as a brother, not as forgotten, but as heard, and not as cursed, but as blessed. And that is a truth worth revisiting with honesty, courage, and humility. And once we accept that the Bible itself presents Ishmael as blessed rather than rejected, the next question we must honestly ask is why this truth faded from popular Christian consciousness, because Scripture did not erase Ishmael. People did, often unintentionally, by reading later theological conclusions back into earlier texts. And when we examine the historical and cultural context of Genesis, we discover that primogeniture, the status of the firstborn, mattered deeply in the ancient world, and Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son, born not through immorality, but through a culturally accepted practice aimed at preserving lineage. And although God later chose Isaac for a specific covenantal role, the Bible never says that this choice nullified God's promises to Ishmael, because divine election in Scripture is about responsibility, not favoritism. And throughout the Bible, we see God choosing certain individuals or nations to carry a message, not because they are more loved, but because they are entrusted. And this distinction is often lost in modern readings, leading to the false assumption that God's choice of Isaac meant the rejection of Ishmael, when in fact the text repeatedly affirms both lines. And when we look closely at God's language to Hagar, we see something extraordinary, because Hagar is the only woman in the Bible who names God, calling him the God who sees. And this moment does not occur within the household of promise, but in the wilderness, where Ishmael's life is preserved, and that alone should cause us to pause, because God reveals himself most intimately, not only in temples and altars, but also in deserts and desperation. And the Bible's God listens to the cry of a marginalized Mo, Thur and her child, responding with mercy, provision, and reassurance. And if we are honest readers of Scripture, we must admit that this portrayal challenges simplistic narratives of exclusion, because God's compassion crosses social boundaries, ethnic divisions, and future religious labels. And when Americans are taught that the biblical story is about one favored people versus everyone else, they miss the broader theological message that runs through both the Hebrew Bible and later prophetic writings, which is that God's ultimate concern is faithfulness, justice, and humility, not lineage alone. And this is why later prophets speak of nations streaming toward divine truth, not being locked out of it. And when we consider how Ishmael's descendants are later described as living near their kin, trading with them, interacting with them, and sometimes even intermarrying, the Bible does not portray an eternal feud mandated by God, but rather a complex human family shaped by choices, misunderstandings, and historical developments. And this distinction matters profoundly today, because many modern conflicts are retroactively projected onto ancient texts, turning Scripture into a justification for division rather than a call to understanding. And as someone who once approached the Bible through inherited theological filters, I can testify that when those filters are removed, the text speaks with surprising clarity and balance, acknowledging Isaac's covenantal role while affirming Ishmael's legitimacy, dignity, and divine blessing. And it is worth noting that the Bible never commands believers to despise Ishmael or his descendants, never instructs them to erase his legacy, and never portrays God as withdrawing his mercy from him. And yet popular retellings often do exactly that, substituting silence for substance. And when later readers encounter Islam's reverence for Ishmael, many assume it is a contradiction of biblical teaching, when in fact it is a continuation of a biblical acknowledgement that God's engagement with humanity did not stop at one branch of Abraham's family. And this realization does not threaten Christian faith. It invites it to mature, because a mature faith is not afraid of complexity, nor is it dependent on denying the worth of others. And when we read the Bible carefully, we find that God's promises unfold through multiple paths, sometimes intersecting, sometimes diverging, but always under divine awareness. And the God who guides Isaac is the same God who protects Ishmael, not two different deities with competing agendas. And when we recognize this, we are compelled to reconsider how we speak about faith, heritage, and divine purpose, because Scripture itself models a God who listens before judging, who blesses before boundaries, and who hears the cry of the vulnerable regardless of their future identity. And perhaps the most important lesson Ishmael teaches us is not about ancestry, but about divine attentiveness, because his very name reminds us that God hears and that truth should reshape how believers approach one another today, with humility instead of hostility, curiosity instead of fear, and understanding instead of inherited suspicion. And if Americans were encouraged to engage the Bible with this spirit, they would find that the story of Ishmael is not a problem to be explained away, but a bridge to be understood, one that points toward a broader vision of faith grounded in compassion, historical honesty, and trust in a God whose mercy cannot be confined by human divisions. And when Scripture is allowed to speak without distortion, Ishmael stands not as a forgotten figure, but as a living testimony that God's promises are wider than we were taught, deeper than we assumed, and still relevant to how we understand faith, family, and divine justice today.